Nothing happened, yet every glance, every touch, left my heart unsettled. How could someone change my world without even trying? It started on an ordinary afternoon, one of those days where the world seems to hum softly in the background, and nothing remarkable is expected. I was at the cafe, the kind of place where time slows and the aroma of coffee mixes with the faint scent of old books from the corner shelf. That's when I saw her. She wasn't loud or dramatic. In fact, she seemed almost unaware of the attention she drew. Yet there was something about her presence that made everything else fade slightly, like the room dimmed just enough for her to stand in quiet focus. She moved with a calm grace, each gesture measured but natural. The way she lifted her cup, the slight tilt of her head as she read, or the way sunlight caught in her hair, giving it a warm, golden halo. Couldn't look away. I noticed little things that didn't matter to anyone else but somehow mattered to me. The soft warmth in her smile when the barista handed her drink, the gentle crease of thought on her brow as she skimmed the pages of her notebook, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a faintly self-conscious hesitation. Each movement drew my attention, made my heart pull in directions I hadn't anticipated. And then there was the subtle way she carried herself. Confident yet quiet, graceful but not unattainable. She was older than me by a few years, I realized, but age didn't seem to matter. What struck me was the depth behind her eyes, the quiet strength in her posture, the kind of presence that makes you feel simultaneously noticed and invisible at the same time. I remember the moment our hands brushed. It was so fleeting, so accidental. I reached for the sugar container at the same time she did, our fingers colliding lightly. A spark ran through me, quick and electric, though she barely seemed to notice. I, however, felt it long after our hands separated, lingering in my veins like an unspoken question. Who is she, and why does she make my chest ache this way? I sat there longer than necessary, pretending to read, but all my attention was stolen by the rhythm of her movements, the soft cadence of her voice when she murmured a word to herself, the faint sound of laughter as she spoke to the barista. Every detail seemed amplified. The faint scent of her perfume, a blend of vanilla and something musky I couldn't place, the gentle warmth she radiated even across the table. Nothing happened that day. There was no conversation, no dramatic gesture, no sudden moment of connection. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I felt a pull, quiet but insistent, like the soft tug of a tide beneath calm waters. She had entered my world without a word, leaving an imprint that refused to fade. And I knew, even in that first fleeting encounter, that things would not remain ordinary for long. The next encounter wasn't planned, yet it felt inevitable. I found myself in the same cafe a few days later, trying to convince myself it was coincidence. She was there again, tucked into her usual corner, a book spread open before her, a cup of coffee steaming softly at her side. My chest tightened at the sight of her. The way she seemed so composed, so serene, as if the world paused around her. Fate, it seemed, had its own design. I ended up at the same table when the cafe filled beyond capacity. Our shoulders brushed lightly as I slid my chair closer. A small, almost imperceptible warmth spread through me, and I caught the faintest trace of her perfume again. A comforting mix of vanilla and something woody, grounding yet intriguing. Neither of us spoke at first. We only exchanged a glance, the kind that held recognition without needing words. And then it happened, a spill minor but enough to force interaction. A napkin, a quick apology, our hands reaching simultaneously. Our fingers touched, lingering a second too long, and I felt the subtle jolt of electricity that I remembered from our first encounter. She laughed softly, a delicate sound that made my chest ache with a mix of surprise and longing. We began talking, hesitantly at first, over shared observations about the cafe, the weather, trivialities. Yet even in such mundane conversation, I noticed how her voice carried layers, warmth, curiosity, and a hint of unspoken melancholy. My own words felt slower, careful, as if speaking too fast might shatter the fragile tension hovering between us. I observed her gestures, how her hands moved gracefully as she spoke, fingers brushing against her notebook or gently lifting her coffee cup. She laughed again, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and for a fleeting moment, our eyes met and held unbroken. I felt the faintest rush of heat in my cheeks, a magnetic pull that made even breathing seem deliberate. The most unexpected part was how natural it felt to be near her. Leaning slightly closer, mirroring her movements unconsciously, I realized that proximity brought comfort, not tension. I wanted to stay there, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her without crossing boundaries, savoring the quiet intimacy of shared space. As our conversation drew to a close, there was no dramatic farewell, just a lingering glance, a subtle nod, and the awareness that our accidental closeness had shifted something imperceptibly but irrevocably. My heart refused to return to its ordinary rhythm. Her presence, the light touch of her hand, the cadence of her voice, all of it lingered, wrapping around me long after she left. Nothing overt happened again, yet I knew the dynamic had changed. What began as curiosity had deepened into something subtler, richer, the kind of connection that simmers quietly, grows under the surface, and insists on being noticed. I walked away feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and hesitation, acutely aware that every future encounter carried the potential to unravel something I wasn't yet ready to name. It wasn't a dramatic moment, nothing like a storm or a sudden confession. It was quiet, almost fragile, the kind of moment that slips past the world unnoticed but leaves a mark you can't erase. We found ourselves walking together after the cafe incident, the city streets bathed in late afternoon light. I noticed the gentle sway of her hair in the breeze, the warmth radiating from her presence, the way her eyes seemed to absorb everything yet reveal so little. Then, unexpectedly, she spoke about something personal, a small difficulty she'd been facing, a frustration she hadn't shared with anyone else. Her voice was calm, but there was a subtle tremor, a vulnerability tucked beneath the confidence she always carried. I felt a surge of protectiveness, an urge to reassure her without overstepping boundaries. I responded honestly, cautiously sharing a fear I rarely spoke aloud, something small but significant to me. The words came easier than I expected, almost as if the quiet trust in her presence encouraged honesty. She listened intently, eyes soft, her gaze steady but kind, and in that moment, I realized how rare it was to be heard without judgment. Our conversation slowed, punctuated by comfortable silences. I noticed the smallest details, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the crisp air, the warmth of her hand as she gestured while speaking, the soft cadence of her voice when she laughed at a fleeting thought. Each detail rooted me in the moment, made me aware of her in a way that went beyond mere attraction. And then there was the subtle touch. She lightly rested her hand on my arm, not to console, but almost instinctively, as if grounding herself in the shared moment. I felt the warmth of her skin, the gentle pressure that communicated more than words ever could. My chest tightened, a mix of longing and awe. I realized I was drawn not just to her presence, but to her openness, her courage in sharing even the smallest fragment of herself. We walked a little further, our steps slowing unconsciously to match each other's rhythm. There was a pause, a moment where words felt inadequate, yet silence carried everything necessary. I felt an unspoken connection, a subtle acknowledgement of the pull we couldn't ignore, even though neither of us named it. It was ordinary and extraordinary all at once. Nothing had happened in the way the world might expect. No declarations, no dramatic gestures. And yet, something profound had shifted. The accidental closeness had transformed into something more intimate, emotional, undeniable. My thoughts lingered on her long after we parted, replaying the warmth of her hand, the softness in her voice, the way her presence seemed to anchor me in ways I hadn't anticipated. In that quiet, shared vulnerability, I understood that our connection was no longer just curiosity or fleeting attraction. It was the beginning of something deeper, a slow, deliberate thread weaving us together, one subtle glance, one gentle touch, one shared word at a time. I knew, even then, that the journey ahead would be defined by these quiet moments, where emotions spoke louder than words ever could. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the city's noise softened into a distant hum, and shadows stretched long across the streets. We found ourselves together again, not by design but circumstance, walking along a narrow path lined with trees whose leaves rustled gently in the breeze. I could feel her presence beside me, subtle yet undeniable, a warmth that pressed against the edge of my awareness without demanding attention. The tension between us was tangible, though neither of us spoke of it. We walked side by side, our steps naturally falling into sync. At one point, our arms brushed lightly. A spark traveled up my arm, subtle, electric, and I caught myself stealing a glance at her. She seemed unaware of the effect she had on me, or perhaps she was careful not to reveal it. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, her eyes meeting mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and my chest tightened in ways I wasn't prepared to confront. Every movement, every gesture seemed amplified. The way she shifted her weight, the gentle sway of her hair as the wind teased it loose from her braid, the softness of her hand as she tucked it into the pocket of her coat. It all seemed charged with a quiet, unspoken energy. I wanted to reach out, to close the space between us, yet hesitation held me back. Her presence made the air feel heavier, sweeter, and somehow more intimate. I became acutely aware of my own breathing, of the slight thump of my heart, of the warmth radiating from her shoulder as we walked. Each accidental touch, each lingering glance, seemed to communicate what neither of us dared to say aloud. Internally, I wrestled with questions I hadn't expected to ask myself. Was I imagining the pull I felt? Was she feeling it too? Or was this simply my own desire projecting onto her calm composure? And yet, even as my mind struggled for rationality, my body responded with a clarity I couldn't deny, a readiness, a longing, a need for proximity that was almost painful in its intensity. The most striking moment came when we paused at a quiet corner, waiting for the light to change. We stood shoulder to shoulder, closer than either of us usually allowed. I could feel her subtle warmth, the faint rhythm of her breathing, the soft brush of her hair against my arm. A part of me wanted to speak, to bridge the distance, yet another part, the part aware of boundaries, of age, of propriety, held me back. Silence stretched, heavy but intimate. Neither of us moved, and yet the tension between us hummed with a life of its own. Every glance, every subtle touch, every shared breath seemed to deepen the connection, even in its restraint. There was no need for words. The unspoken acknowledgement of mutual desire, carefully contained, carefully measured, spoke volumes. As we parted that evening, walking in opposite directions, the tension lingered like an echo. I knew that this invisible thread connecting us had tightened, pulling us closer without a single confession. And somewhere in that quiet, careful space between us, I realized that the slow-burn attraction was no longer just a possibility. It was inevitable. The days that followed were quieter, slower, but the connection between us had grown in subtle, unspoken ways. It wasn't marked by dramatic gestures or bold declarations, but by the little moments that seemed to matter more than words could ever express. I began to notice the small things she did, the way she would glance my way, just enough to check if I was comfortable, or how her eyes softened when she caught me looking at her. One afternoon, she noticed I looked tired. It wasn't obvious to anyone else. A slight slump in my shoulders, a heavier sigh as I poured my coffee, but she saw it. Without a word, she placed a hand on my arm, light and fleeting, just enough to ground me. The warmth of her skin pressed through the fabric of my sleeve, and a quiet steadiness spread through me. It was a simple gesture, almost invisible to the world, yet it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. There were other moments too, each seemingly trivial but layered with meaning. She would remember my coffee order without being told, hand me a notebook she knew I'd forgotten, or offer an umbrella on a day when rain threatened. Every act of care felt deliberate, yet effortless, like she was naturally attuned to my needs without making me aware of it. And each time, I felt an unexpected flutter, a mix of appreciation, admiration, and something tender that refused to be named. One evening, while walking through a quiet park, she paused to point out a cluster of flowers, their colors catching the last light of the setting sun. She knelt to examine them, and I found myself crouching beside her, drawn not just to the beauty of the flowers but to the quiet intimacy of being in her space. Our knees brushed lightly, a soft, accidental contact, and I felt a warmth ripple through me. She looked up at me then, her eyes catching mine, and for a brief moment, the world shrank to just the two of us. A shared smile, a quiet acknowledgement of a bond growing stronger. Even simple conversations became a form of care. She would listen intently, her gaze never faltering, offering gentle nods or a quiet laugh that made me feel heard in ways I hadn't realized I needed. When I spoke of something stressful, she would lean slightly closer, her hand brushing against mine in a gesture that was casual yet grounding, offering reassurance without words. These moments of care were shaping our connection in ways both subtle and profound. They created a rhythm, a language of touch and attention that didn't require confession. Each gesture, each shared glance, each accidental brush of hands, wove a delicate tapestry of trust, comfort, and quiet longing. By the end of the day, as I reflected on these interactions, I realized that I was not merely drawn to her presence. I was drawn to how she made me feel, seen, supported, and quietly understood. And while nothing had happened in the conventional sense, these small acts of care had drawn us closer, deepening the unspoken bond that neither of us was ready to name, yet both of us felt in the marrow of our bones. The bond between us had grown in whispers, in shared glances, in the gentle language of small touches and unspoken understanding. By now, I could feel the subtle pull of our connection, stronger with every moment we spent together, yet still restrained by the careful boundaries neither of us dared to cross. It was one of those evenings when the world seemed to fold into itself, the city lights casting long reflections on wet pavement, the air carrying the faint scent of rain and autumn leaves. We found ourselves walking together after a quiet dinner, our steps unconsciously in rhythm. The conversation flowed easily at first about trivial things, the kind of dialogue that fills space without demanding intimacy. Yet beneath it lay the unspoken tension, the quiet acknowledgement of attraction neither of us had the courage to name. Then, in a pause, she laughed softly at a fleeting thought, and I noticed the way her eyes held mine a beat too long. I felt my chest tighten, a familiar ache I had learned to recognize. I wanted to reach out, to brush a strand of hair from her face, to close the space between us, but restraint held me back. She was older, wiser, and there was a gentleness in her gaze that reminded me to tread carefully. And then came the confession. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet admission tucked into a casual remark. She spoke of moments where she felt understood, moments where my presence had mattered more than she expected. I felt my heart lurch, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied. She noticed me, truly noticed me, and in that, I found a courage I hadn't expected. I responded with my own quiet truth, letting slip the awareness I had been holding close. How every interaction, every shared laugh, every accidental touch had been imprinting itself on me. I spoke of the warmth I felt in her presence, the way my mind lingered on her long after we parted. The words were careful, almost shy, yet they carried the weight of everything I had been feeling in silence. We walked for a few more moments in silence, the tension between us now palpable but comfortable. Our hands brushed lightly, a soft contact that neither pulled away from, and for a heartbeat, the world around us disappeared. I noticed the subtle rise and fall of her breath, the warmth radiating from her shoulder as we passed close together. Every unspoken thought, every quiet confession, had condensed into this shared awareness, a delicate, tender acknowledgement of feelings we were only beginning to name. It was a turning point. The connection we had nurtured in glances, gestures, and moments of care had evolved into something deeper, mutual recognition of desire, tempered with caution and respect. We hadn't crossed the line into romance. Not yet, but the emotional intimacy was undeniable. Every look, every lingering pause, spoke volumes, and I knew that from this point on, there was no pretending that nothing was happening. As the evening ended and we went our separate ways, I carried with me the quiet thrill of recognition, the knowledge that we both felt it, that our slow-burn connection had reached a new depth, and that the moments to come would be charged with the tender, unspoken possibilities of what could be. The days that followed were marked by a quiet, comfortable awareness between us. A rhythm that existed without overt declarations, yet carried the unmistakable weight of mutual understanding. Our connection had grown layer by layer, woven through shared glances, soft touches, and moments of care, each small gesture echoing with unspoken meaning. It was a late afternoon when it felt most tangible. The sun was dipping low, spilling golden light across the park where we often found ourselves walking, a space that had quietly become ours. We moved side by side, neither speaking at first, but the air between us was charged with familiarity and a quiet anticipation. Every brush of our arms, every accidental touch of fingers, carried warmth that lingered far longer than the moment itself. At one point, she paused, leaning slightly to adjust her coat, and I instinctively reached to help, my fingers brushing hers for a heartbeat that felt like eternity. Neither of us pulled away. The world narrowed to the gentle rhythm of her breath, the subtle heat radiating from her shoulder, and the soft cadence of our steps on the path. It was in these small, shared moments that everything, the tension, the longing, the unspoken affection, crystallized into something tangible yet delicate. We found a bench bathed in the golden light of the setting sun and sat side by side. Our shoulders touched lightly, almost by accident, and I felt an unexpected comfort in the closeness. She turned to me, her gaze steady but soft, and we shared a quiet smile, one that said everything we hadn't spoken. There was no need for grand confessions or dramatic gestures. The intimacy of this simple closeness was enough. I remembered all the moments that had led us here. The accidental brush of hands at the cafe, the shared laughter, the quiet conversations where vulnerabilities were revealed and received with care. Each of these moments had built a bridge between us, leading to this point where silence could carry meaning, where a glance could communicate understanding and warmth without a single word. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, she rested her head briefly against my shoulder. I felt the gentle steadiness of her presence, the subtle pulse of her heartbeat against my chest. In that moment, the slow-burn tension that had simmered for weeks, perhaps months, found a quiet, satisfying resolution. There was no rush, no need to define it all at once. It was enough to feel the connection, to know it was real and mutual. When it was time to leave, we rose together, and our hands brushed once more, lingering, intentional this time. A faint smile played on her lips, and I felt the warmth of understanding, of shared feeling, settle between us. We parted with the gentle knowledge that this was not the end, but a beginning, a relationship defined by patience, respect, and a deep emotional bond. Even as I walked away, the warmth of her presence lingered in my mind, a quiet glow that would carry me through the days ahead. Nothing had happened in the dramatic sense, yet everything had changed. In the subtle intimacy, the soft touches, and the unspoken understanding, we had found something rare and enduring, a connection that felt profound, heartfelt, and entirely ours. If this story of quiet longing and slow-burn connection touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story that lingers long after the words are spoken. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt a connection so subtle, yet so unforgettable?